Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody today for what is now our fifth of these town hall conversations. I hope you're all having a great summer. The last of our conversations was on July 17th, and thankfully things have gotten a little better in Houston since the last time we talked, and we'll be reviewing some of those data in a little bit. To my left, we have Dirk Sossman again, who you've met several times, who's going to be updating us on treatments and vaccines. And then to our right, I have Dr. Faisal Masood. Dr. Faisal Masood is going to kick things off in just a second, talking about critical care. And then I'll close giving an update and as well as talking about schools and some advice about schools. And then we'll do a significant Q&A session with the questions that y'all have sent in. So Dr. Masood, who heads up all of our critical care across Houston Methodist, is going to talk to us about taking care of patients with COVID and all of the patients who do not have COVID who've needed critical care during this time. Dr. Masood.
Thank you, Dr. Boom. Good afternoon. I'm going to be really taking you through the journey of the last couple of months, guiding to you how our cases have gone about, giving a little bit of insight how these patients have fared, and as Dr. Boom mentioned, patients who have COVID and non-COVID both, because our guiding principle is we are obligated and we're going to provide the best care to each and every patient, no matter what the diagnosis is. So let's start with how these patients and the cases have shown up. In this graph that you see, in March and April, when we had an initial peak, as you see, the critical care is the yellow line, the second from below, and the blue line is the total number of cases, which is, so as you can see, we had a little peak, we had a lot of patients, we managed through, which settled down in May. And then you saw a sudden peak of a lot of patients, and it became 3 times the patients. And even in intensive care unit, across our Houston Methodist Hospital system, we have a lot of patients. And critical care patients typically have a lag behind patients who get regularly admitted to the hospital. And we were getting patients not only from our emergency room, but other patients from everywhere else also. And the bottom green line is patients who are in what we call as intermediate care unit, that is between the intensive care, who are extremely sick, and patients who are sick enough, but they are not sick enough to be in the ICU, but not healthy enough to be on the regular floor. So you can see our volumes peaked up, and now they're coming down, and we're kind of plateauing to the phase. So this just to give you perspective how all the resources and volume. And I'm sure on the media and everywhere else, you heard about ICU cases, volume. This is what we had to manage and deal with. So just to give you a background where we are and where we are heading. Next. So this is a bar graph which really tells you the number of admissions. So these individual bar graphs tells you specific days and everything. It will peak up and coming down, as you can see on your right hand side, that there is steady decline, but they fluctuate. And these are the patients who are getting sicker on the floors from coming up, but the trend is appropriate, and it follows all the trajectory of patients getting admitted, which is following the trajectory of the city and the Texas Medical Center also. But just give you how many patients were getting admitted on a daily basis, and we had to keep on expanding. So let's talk about how did we do all of this stuff, because you can't just create critical care beds, you can't just create doctors, nurses, therapists. So we have to be very innovative even from the beginning. So in June and July, overall ICU capacity had to be increased across the system. We had to create intermediate beds so that we can meet the demands of all the patients, COVID and non-COVID combined. This was different than March and April because, as you know, the whole state shut down. But in this time, there were a lot of patients who chose not to come to the hospital in March, April, and even May, who needed care. And we are obligated to provide, and we have to provide care to all patients. So this was a much more challenging situation. Our critical care teams are stretched to meet the surge of patients. We created certain specialized units. We created dedicated COVID units. We created units in which we can give high oxygen. We change our strategies that we can manage them. They don't deteriorate. They don't need ventilations. We create this in-between unit that allowed us to manage a lot more complex patients and yet safely get them through. In August, we are trending right now in this month to a new normal. The way I see it, the new normal includes most of our regular critically ill patients, surgical patients, transplant patients, all categories, and then a certain number of patients who will require COVID-related ICU. So that's what we feel that that'll be a new normal. So that's what we are right now and will be for the near future. This to give you an idea of, this is just a sample of all the new protocol, all the new processes, all the new guidelines, all the new steps we have to create dedicated to this disease process. Because further down the line, I'll show you some data and some information which tell you that this disease is so much different than regular flu. This disease we are still learning and we're still evolving. And this disease so much, so we have to create a lot of those things. This slide going to give you an idea, just a sample of some of the new ways of managing patients, new ways of taking care, getting the IVs and pump outside, taking the whole, creating cards, creating therapies, creating tools, creating other strategies to minimize exposure, to provide world-class care, and to really get the patients through. And even with our latest one, which is our Care Since COVID app, to follow the patients when they even get discharged. So this is an example of some of the innovative way. And believe me, this is just a snapshot. I could not fit all of them in one slide or two slides. There's a lot of work and a lot of people all across work together. Another virtual innovative was our virtual ICU impact. Virtual ICU team right now are covering almost 200 patients at night in all our main intensive care units in the main campus, and now we're expanding into system ICUs. We're using them to help patients in the intermediate care units with technology. And what it does is, virtual ICU really means there's a team dedicated in a command center which with cameras and technologies and all the data, all the algorithm is picking up patient, is supporting the bedside team, and they are preventing a lot of save of PPE. They're picking up signs early. We have these tools which we can share with the families, and families can see patients. And that is something which is crucial, and I will elaborate that in the slide why it is so important. Efficient algorithms, so this has allowed us to take care of patients in COVID and non-COVID combined. And that is one of the key factors, I believe, that allowed us to take care of a lot more patients to compare to what we were. So as you can see, at Houston Methodist, we're constantly innovating. So we were not planning and doing all of this stuff like 1 year ago or 2 years ago. And now how we've evolved, engaged, and innovative to help prepare and do care for right now and for the future. Care for the non-COVID isolation is really, we had to be the extended family. As you've all seen across the country, when the patients are now going into ICUs or even COVID ICUs, the families who used to spend a lot of time in the hospital, in the intensive care unit, they were there. They were our partners to help care of their loved one. Now that has all changed for right now at least. We have become the extended family between patients and their other natural families. We are their extension. We are the bridge between the families and loved one. We are having them see their loved one through our virtual ICU, putting them in with iPads, with virtual ICU, so they can see, they can talk. And as you can see, New York Times even published a story about how we are helping our most vulnerable, how families are being connected. And these are heart-warming and heart-touching stories because we are all humans. And Methodist values and Methodist ICARE values really focused on our patients and our creed. And I think that to us was not only we take excellent care of patient, but patient and their family. So that's something which we have taken on, and that's an added work, but we are happy to do that. This slide is very important. And the reason is, it just goes to show that this is not just a lung disease. It affects your brain in multiple ways with strokes, clots, confusion. It affects your kidneys. Up to 20% may have kidney damage. It affects your liver. It affects your GI tract or your absorptions. It affects your skin. It affects your lungs, as we already know that. It affects your heart. And the complexity of this disease, even the first 8-9 months, has taught us so much that this is just not a lung disease. It is a disease which affects blood vessels, which affects other tissue. That's why this disease has a lot of impact of health and causing more deaths and short-term and long-term impact. So this is very, very important slide just to give you an insight how all the challenges and why do people have different symptoms, why do they have all of the different. This is a slide of our patients who were COVID and ICU length of stay. If you were in an intensive care unit, the bar on the right-hand side, orange one shows you that your length of stay in the hospital a lot more compared to non-COVID. If you were not COVID, you were a lot less. It highlights that we had to take care of these patients for a long period of time because they just don't bounce back compared to our other patients who used to stay a lot more shorter. So we really have to kind of redefine our care patterns, redefine our approaches, re-innovate all of this to take care of these patients. That's one of the reasons why there is a lag of critical care capacity because these patients are staying in the ICU. This is a data to show because everybody talked about ventilator utilization, ventilator this. There was a lot of national highlight put on. With our innovative approach, which are managing patients on the acute care, on the intermediate care, with our putting patients on the tummies or tummy tuck or prone, with all of our therapies, which we have done with plasma, remdesivir, steroids and everything, we have a lot less number of, on the average, around 11% as a system with ventilator compared to other places, the country and the world. And I think that plays a role in how well these patients do and how we're able to get them through. Now this slide is a little bit broader, and I want to share this slide mainly for our audience. We are committed to take care of all critical care patients, and one of the focus was by all the energy focused on COVID patients, which was still not the majority for ICU patients, majority were non-COVID. Are we doing a great job of delivering care to all patients? And I'm happy to share you that this is a little bit of a busy slide, but this data shows that Vizient is an organization which compares national top academic medical center, about 100 plus, in their outcomes, and they compete with the data. And as you can see from this one on the graph on the left upper side, the blue is Houston Methodist Hospital. And the other ones are some of the top names in the country, some of the key institutions. And what this data shows that if you were in Houston Methodist intensive care unit critical care, your chance of dying was less than half as predicted. That means if you were in other places, your chance of death was a lot more higher. The graph on the upper right-hand side shows that our patients in Houston Methodist critical care unit were some of the sickest ones. The graph in the bottom shows that they stayed longer, but I'm happy to have them longer and alive and get them home safely. So whether you are COVID or non-COVID, we're getting them patients safely, even how complex you are. If you have a transplant now or our president will get you through this thing. This should reassure our Houston community, Texas community, or the country that if you come to Houston Methodist Hospital, we'll get you through it. We want these patients to come. We want to take care of them because they deserve the care. They need the care. And your care will be world-class care. And that's why this data is so important, because it is all ICU patients. I don't want people to stop coming to hospital because they're afraid to come. We have dedicated units, we have dedicated, and we're getting people through. That's why I wanted to share you this slide. Again, this is what you heard, some heart-lung machines in which people who are really the sickest of sick and they can't live. We have those heart-lung machine patients also. And this data shows, especially on the right side, in July and August, we were putting a lot more than early. And we were able to get through that. So we have the capacity, we have the delivery. We've had some patients who have had postpartum. We had family members. We had a husband and wife couple who both on a heart-lung machine, and we're getting them through. So we have that delivery also. Houston Methodist has a proud tradition of not only innovation, but education, research, and trials. I'm happy to say that this is just a sample of some of the trials we are doing nationwide. We are one of the most active trial sites in the country with so many trials. but we have a team which evaluates all of those things. We feel which have to be the most benefit for the patient, which has the most to contribute to knowledge, which has the most to really make an impact all over. So we choose those trials, and we do work with our patients and families. We also, with innovation, we have partners like Reliant. They partnered us with innovation funds with our NMED program of Houston Methodist, and we are creating this educational and innovation approach with our NMED program for our medical students and everything from an NMED to really create things which we've not thought about, because I do believe they are much more brighter minds. They come up with things we don't know. And also the Care Sense program, this is so important. Why? Because when these patients go home, we are learning that they don't always bounce back. We want to follow them. We follow how they recover, how they have any depression, PTSD, early intervention, early pickup, because we are committed to our patients who come to us, not only while they're us. This is an example that Houston Methodist, with Dr. Boom's leadership, he has been, if you go to international, he will be there, and he's educating our Houston community, Texas, statewide, nationwide, and critical care has been forefront into really educating, because we are not only educating the right way, we are fighting infodemic, which is classified by WHO about misinformation, misleading. We want to put the facts in front of our public, because we want you to make the best decision possible. This is some of that we have, again, this is a highlight of all the national journals where our research, our therapies, and these have been utilized by people all across the country to change the process and protocol and the knowledge learned. So this is given an example. We feel committed to the healthcare of all across, because we are a leading institution in the country. This is just an example. The CHEST is an organization for chest physicians. They worked with one of our physicians, Dr. Couture, and gave a grant to study more, because we're still learning. So this is an example, it's a nationwide grant. Now, come back to it. One of the reasons we created the Care Sense is that majority of patients who come to the hospital or even come to the ICU don't just bounce back. They have a lot of issues going on, whether fatigue, exhaustion, headache. They have got neurological issues or other complications, lung, heart, and kidneys. We have to follow them, because that's another new healthcare need which we are defining and treating. And this is an example. Up to 32% have 1 to 2 symptoms. Up to 55% or half of them have 3 or more symptoms. Who's going to manage them? Who's going to help them? We want to be a resource, and that's why we have got Care Sense, SEMP, another word. Now, next phase. What do we do now? So I can tell you that the teams of our critical care teams have been battle tested. We've been pushed, we have delivered, and we keep on delivering that. We keep on focusing that, and we're ready for the next phase, whether it is the next flu season, whether school opening, whether other disease, we're ready. We all are still learning. We're still learning that there is short-term immediate impact in the intensive care, but there are long-term impact also, and we're partnering with our long-term and outcome research in our departments to follow up and manage them. There is a need to focus on how best to manage these patients in ICUs, how to prevent this complication to begin with. And that's where we need us and others to invest and to learn to do that. If we have better understanding of these things, I'm very confident that we can prevent a lot of complication. The key focus is in complication. And the last but not the least is the healthcare team member, family members. We are working, and we want to partner, and we want to learn, and we want to do best to provide the best support to our family member. And the healthcare team who have been putting their lives on hold to get through this thing, and their own well-being and their family well-being is so important to us. With that, the last one, I'd like to extend my gracious thanks to all the nurses, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, physicians, ICU, all physician team members, and to our community. We all are united in the fight against COVID-19. However, it has been exhausted, but I think we have been doing it, and I'm willing to do it. So thank you, Dr. Boom, for allowing me to give a little bit of insight about critical care. I think this is the team which is working with all the other partners across to make it deliver.
Well, thank you, Dr. Masood. I think you all can see, and I want to say a profound thank you to you and all your team members. I mean, the amount of work that they have done over the last few months, and their journey is not over by any stretch. and the amazing compassionate care they've provided. It really is awe-inspiring, and you've provided just tremendous leadership. So a big round of applause, hopefully, from the whole audience here, because you and your teams have done remarkable work for the citizens of Houston. So God bless you and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu.
Now, I want to move on to Dirk Sossman. Dirk's going to give us an update, as he has done in the past, on evolutions with therapies and evolutions with vaccines. Dirk.
Great. Well, listening to Faisal's talk, I just have to comment, what a difference 6 months makes. This time in February, we didn't know what was going to hit us, and nobody in the world was ready for it. And now, although we're seeing more cases, this has not gone away. It's not going to go away in the near future. We're just so much more prepared for it. We're able to handle so many more patients with COVID-19 and also keep providing high quality, safe care to all other patients. It's quite something. And add my thanks to Dr. Booms, to you and your team, Faisal.
Thank you.
Now, as Faisal showed you in one of his slides, we have many, many clinical trials going on, and time does not allow me to go over all of them. So I'm just going to go over a few that we're particularly excited about or interested in, then talk a bit about vaccines and where that stands, and then last, a little bit of advice about the winter and the flu season. So let's get right into it. One thing that we believe is one of the answers to COVID-19 is antiviral antibody treatments. The first of these was convalescent plasma. We here at Houston Methodist were the first in the country to use this. We beat Mount Sinai in New York by about 12 hours, I think, but we were first.
It's always good to be in New York.
We've treated just over 350 patients now, which was all that our research approval from the FDA would allow us to treat. And so we're currently in discussions with them about what comes next. We were only allowed to treat severe, life-threatening COVID-19 cases with this plasma. With that, our data shows that compared to matched controls, and hasten to say this is not a randomized controlled trial, so the controls were retrospective, what's called propensity matched. In other words, age, sex, obesity, diabetes, other medical conditions. We found that convalescent plasma reduced mortality from 7 to 1.2%. For patients who were treated early, within 72 hours of admission, and if we gave plasma that had a high titer of the anti-spike protein, so very powerful concentrated plasma. Other data from around the world shows a similar reduction in mortality, although, as Dr. Masood pointed out, the actual gross mortality figures are a whole lot better here in Houston, Texas than around the world. So the results are very, very consistent. They are not randomized controlled trials, so it's not the highest level of medical evidence. And you may read in the paper today, the FDA has declined to grant an emergency use authorization for routine, widespread clinical use of plasma. And that's not a no, it's a not yet. I think they're being pretty cautious after all the toing and froing with hydroxychloroquine. They want to see RCT data. But we are pretty much believers in convalescent plasma here at Houston Methodist. We are also doing trials from 2 pharma companies on monoclonal antibodies, which would be the most purified, highest strength antibodies against COVID-19 that can be produced. We believe that this is in a lot of ways going to be even better than convalescent plasma, But of course, that's why we do research. We have to see whether that is really true. But pretty exciting. Also, we're very excited about getting into the NIH-sponsored randomized controlled trial called ACT-3, which compares remdesivir alone, and you know remdesivir is proven to be effective against COVID-19. So remdesivir alone versus remdesivir plus a drug called beta interferon, which is a synthetic protein that mimics the broad-spectrum antiviral proteins produced by the body, which are used to treat a number of conditions. And it seems like the COVID-19 illness tends to suppress this defense mechanism, and so we think that giving a synthetic interferon could be a very, very powerful adjunct to the antiviral drug. A couple of smaller trials around the world, one in the UK, the Synergan trial, another one that was done in Hong Kong, tend to support this. But again, this is why we do research. It sounds great. We have to prove whether it's great or whether it only sounds great and really doesn't work. But we're pretty excited about this one. Another one that we have treated 50 patients now is Aviptadil, or RLF-100. You will have seen some news coverage of this. It's produced by a company that is very aggressive about its public relations. It's a relatively old drug that's been kicking around for a while and has not really found a documented clinical use yet. But some of our doctors believe that, at least anecdotally, they've seen some really dramatic responses to this. So we've treated 50 patients. There are a number of other sites around the country. I believe the Data Safety and Monitoring Board for this trial will meet next week, and we should have some real data on the outcomes by then. So those are just 3 examples of some of the, I would say, higher priority clinical trials that we're doing now. So let's talk about vaccines. First, remember how immunity develops in your body. Something, whether it be an infection or a vaccine, delivers an antigen into your body, in this case a viral antigen. It's processed by certain specialized cells in your body, which present it to a class of white blood cells called helper T cells. Those helper T cells then foster the development of 2 types of viral or immune cells, viral killing cells, B cells and killer T cells. The B cells produce antibodies that bind to the viral antigen and help the body clear it and neutralize it. And the killer T cells that destroy cells which are infected with the virus and therefore interrupt the cycle of viral replication and augmentation. So you want a vaccine to produce B cells and antibodies, and you want it to produce T cells. But you want it to do a whole lot more than that. First and foremost, you want it to be safe. And as I think I've said in previous town halls, if you're going to give this vaccine to 1 billion people, which is kind of what you need to do, and a severe reaction only occurs in 1 in a million, you've got 1,000 people who have got a severe reaction. So the bar for safety is really high with vaccines, and the FDA is not going to approve something that they have doubts about. Does it produce antibodies? Does it produce these T cells, cellular immune response? Does it neutralize the virus? Does it prevent the virus from actually replicating in your body, which would be the highest level of protection? Or can the virus get in there, but it just doesn't produce a very severe disease? Kind of the status of a flu shot. Does the immunity last for a year, for life, for 5 years? Do you need 1 dose of the vaccine or 2? Can you produce it? Can you distribute it? Will people take it? There's a lot of questions that have to be answered. So at least in the Western world, the four leading candidates are Moderna, Pfizer, which is working with a German company called BioNTech, Johnson & Johnson, Oxford University, which is working with AstraZeneca. All these four are either in or entering phase 3 trials. The Moderna vaccine, I read this morning, has recruited about 10,000 volunteers out of the 30,000 that they're hoping to recruit. Oxford is a similar number. I think Pfizer might be a month or so behind. J&J is a little bit behind this. The results so far are quite encouraging. All of them produce antibodies in 100% of those vaccinated. And the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines produce antibodies at a level several times greater than convalescent plasma. All of them seem to produce T cells pretty reliably. The Oxford vaccine seems like it may be a little weaker than the others. And it protects both the Moderna and the J&J vaccine in monkey trials, protect from infection. Very important. These folks are all trying to get emergency use authorization this fall, before the end of 2020. Whether that is going to happen is a little unclear because in a lot of places, including, thankfully, Houston, Texas, the number of cases are going down. And the way you test whether a vaccine is effective, you give it to people and you see if they get sick. Well, if nobody's getting sick, it's pretty hard to tell whether it's the vaccine or just that nobody's getting sick. So we're thinking that December is probably a more reasonable target than September or October, and it could even go into the very beginning of 2021. But I remain fairly optimistic about these vaccines. They all have side effects. Low-grade fever, chills, headaches, sore arm, feeling just generally a little off. In the really high dose groups that the companies have tried, up to 10% have more severe versions of these. But honestly, would you rather feel a little off for a day or would you rather take a chance of dying? I think these side effects are nothing worse than you see with a flu shot. Anybody who's had the shingles vaccine, it's a lot worse than these. And importantly, at least so far, there's no evidence of any of the potential rare and more severe side effects. So pretty much clear so far. Will it be used? A lot of folks who have concerns, who are not going to be first in line. And there is a lot of challenges to actually getting it done. The minute the FDA says, hey, you can use this on people, then you have to start producing billions of vials of special glass, syringes. You have to keep them all refrigerated. If you're going to vaccinate 1 billion people, that's the air freight capacity of 8,000 jumbo jets, customs, health regulations in every country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to do to actually put the rubber on the road here. Lastly, everybody knows I'm a Game of Thrones fan, and I never miss the opportunity to say winter is coming. Unfortunately, here in Houston, winter is coming. And with it will come the common cold, the rhinovirus, the seasonal coronaviruses, the metapneumovirus, and influenza. And we're worried about this. I mean, I hope that this is a false alarm, but I'm scared about this. And I think you should be scared too. In the winter, everybody stays indoors because it's cold outside. They breathe the same air. They're closer to each other. And it turns out that dry, low humidity, heated air is really bad for your body's defense mechanisms. It reduces your innate immune responsiveness. It reduces the mucus blanket that coats your airways, that removes viruses and other particles out of your lungs. And you know, your nasal cavity is about 33 degrees Celsius. Your lungs are about 37 Celsius, like your core body temperature. If the virus gets in there and you're in a cold environment, it could take root. And the low humidity is really, many people think is really a problem in terms of reducing your defenses. So here are some tips. Humidify the air inside your house. The optimal, some virologists from Yale and Harvard believe, is at room temperature about 40 to 60% relative humidity. Let some fresh air in the house occasionally. Even when you're indoors, remember I said, you know, your nose is colder than the rest of your body, and viruses like 33 more than they like 37 degrees. And, you know, they do better. You're less able to fight them off if your mucous membranes are dried out. So consider wearing a face mask even inside the house to keep your nose warm and moist. Get your vitamin D levels checked. If they're low, take 1,000 or 2,000 units of supplementation a day. If your levels are normal, don't take supplements because you're just going to get toxicity and it's not going to help you. Keep washing your hands, get plenty of sleep, the usual recommendations. Most importantly, get your flu shot. This year of all years, get your flu shot. So that's what I have to say. Some great news, I think, on clinical trials. Some really encouraging continued news on vaccines. And start thinking now about how you're going to protect yourself this winter when it's cold. So thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Great advice, and you know, I share your optimism about the vaccine landscape. I hope it's sooner than January, but I think realistically, we're probably looking at first quarter of next year that we're going to see significant vaccinations. But you know, it's been pushing 6 months, and certainly 6 months since, as the world, we were talking about all these issues. So we're less than that away from the beginning of a vaccination campaign. Keep in mind, one of my favorite epidemiologists I follow, he says this is not going to be an on-off switch. This is a rheostat. This is, you know, a dimmer switch when we start doing that. But I think it will be quite helpful, and lots of encouraging news on the treatment front as well. So I want to give y'all an update on the situation in Houston, talk about a couple other key things, and then spend a little bit of time with some questions that you all asked, a multitude of them, that you asked about schools, which is certainly our societal hot topic today. We'll then take a little break and come back and do a bunch of the Q&A. So I'm going to share a little data. One of my slides will replicate what you saw with Dr. Masood. This is TMC data that comes back at us at the TMC from the state. That is this is now a weekly look. So this is a Monday through Sunday look. So the most recent bar goes through 3 days ago. And you can see the number of cases on average that we are seeing across the community when we look at that. What you see is that thankfully it has come down. It has peaked. In fact, it's come down 28% if you look at that peak to the most recent bar. But we're still seeing pretty significant levels on the order of something like 1,700 per day over the last week. This is a concern going forward in that if you look back at April and May, we were at dramatically lower numbers in our community. And so I'll put a little bookmark here as we talk about school opening and we talk about some of the guidelines. Clearly in our minds, at this kind of virus transmission in the community, having something massively open up, 800,000 children in schools, would be extremely problematic for our community. So you'll see that we need to get these numbers down. Now, I'll show you some of our data around testing. So what you see here in the blue bars is the number of tests positive at Houston Methodist each day through the 2 waves. And then you see the percentage of those tests that are positive in the kind of orange line. What you see for our numbers is we're down about 75% if you look at a rolling 7-day average across that peak time that you see there, which is actually a little earlier than the community peak that you saw there. 75-80% decrease, yet I go back to these numbers and they're down 25%. So we're trying to make some sense of that, and I don't have a perfect explanation. I can tell you a couple dynamics I'm pretty sure are at play. One of them is that there have been significant delays in reporting through the state, and so I think we're seeing some batching, and in fact there was a report through, I think it was the Austin American-Statesman, of some significant backlog and batching that happened. I think is going to work itself out over the next week. I think that may be holding those numbers up a little bit. I think another factor clearly is we have a selection bias for sick people. So when you're relatively well and getting just a test done, you're generally not coming to our emergency rooms, which is still our most common site for testing. Certainly we do much clinical testing and others. There may be some other reasons as well, but there's a little disconnect in the data. I'm hopeful that what we're seeing is some leading indicator versus the state data, that we may see that start to drop a little more quickly here in the coming weeks. I don't know that for sure by any stretch, but I'm hoping, because when we think about where we're going to need to get as a community, we need those numbers to come down substantially. These are the numbers of hospitalizations. And again, across the TMC, you can see the number of daily hospitalizations in the blue bars and then a 7-day rolling average. And those have come down, as you can see, very dramatically, much more significantly than the community numbers. Many reasons that could be, including everything else I listed, all the way to masking and potential even for masking, perhaps both decreasing transmission, but also ultimately perhaps decreasing the severity of illness with viral load that could come down. All theoretical reasons, many others as well, but we're watching these data closely. So you've seen this from Dr. Massoud. What I want to call your attention to, though, is something that's getting my attention right now, and that's the last week. Because if you look at that blue line, which is our total number of patients in-house over the last week, it has most definitely leveled at Houston Methodist. I've not seen as significant a leveling yet across the TMC. There may be a little bit, but we're watching that very closely. The fundamental reason being that as we get the virus numbers down in the community, we need to also get the hospitalization numbers down. We were in the 90 to 100 range before what was a very rapid surge, albeit a rapid surge at a point where we had all let our guards down, nobody was masking, all those kinds of things that were happening. But we are very concerned about being at a plateau and then having a potential fall surge occur for any number of reasons, whether it's reopening the economy, whether it's reopening of schools, whether it's the fall, whether it's drier, cooler weather, as Dr. Sossman talked about. So we need to collectively work to get those virus numbers down and, of course, to get this down. If we get those virus numbers from 1,700 down to 200-300, there's no doubt in my mind we will see the hospitalizations follow. So to date now, you can see massive numbers of people we have cared for with COVID. We've now admitted well over 5,400 people to our hospitals. Put that in perspective, by June 10th or so, when we were submitting some data to the federal government, we were at about 1,450. So we've done 4,000 since that time in a little over 2 months. And so it's been a pretty crazy time. We're really happy to see our numbers down by half. But again, if I look at that, the last time we came down by half and plateaued, right now we've come down by half, seem to be plateauing, and we've got to really work together as a community to get this transmission down so that we don't see that kind of riskiness going forward. Very excited and proud of some of the data that we've been able to put together. Actually, just last week, I'm going to need my glasses to look at a couple of these numbers, but just last week, we published in JAMA, it's online already, it will be in the actual publication. really the first study of its sort that looks at characteristics of patients between a first wave and a second wave. So I think very important information for the medical literature. I picked out just a few of the data points. You can easily Google this and find this and take a look, because there's a whole lot of other data. But you see in the right-hand column the p-value, which is how statistically significant something is, and they're all very statistically significant, essentially saying there's only 0.1% chance or probability that the differences you see are based on chance here. And so we saw a 2.5 or so year decrease in average age. We saw a significant increase from about 1 in 4 to over 1 in 3 patients who were less than 50. While we did not see racial differences between Asians, blacks, whites, we did see among that a very dramatic difference, and you've seen this in the press. This reinforces what you've seen in the press in the Hispanic Latino population, from 25.7% to 43%. We've seen a few indicators to suggest also we saw this starting to hit more socioeconomically vulnerable populations. Self-pay, in other words, people without insurance, would be one indicator. It went up almost double, from 11.4 to 19.9. We saw zip code differences in terms of average income. And we also saw less ill people, which was a good thing. It generated fewer people in the ICUs. We've had some better outcomes. It implied to me that people were being more careful who were more vulnerable. But you see here diabetes, hypertension, obesity, all of which have been significant risk factors, were significantly lower the second time around. We'll continue updating these data. These went through July 7th with this second surge, with the delay time to get it into JAMA, but we'll be continuing to update those. So I want to talk about, kind of one of the things I continually hear. You actually saw some data from Dr. Masood showing you one of the clinical reasons, which is how omnipresent this virus is and how it attacks so many parts of our body, that this is not just the flu. But I want to come back to some of the data we've looked at in some of our analyses here at Houston Methodist, because it still is a thread we hear out there in the press, and particularly on the internet and with different people talking about this. So many of you heard us speak, way back when, in early February. I must have presented this slide a dozen to 15 times to internal, external audiences in kind of early February, as we were talking about the fact that COVID-19 was in China and we were getting prepared and we didn't know what would happen. And this plots the R, which is the spreading factor, basically. How many people does each person infect? That's on the x-axis, against the mortality on the y-axis. And in pink, you saw this against a bunch of different viruses. And what you saw was a lot of unknown, right? There was a very broad range of, well, this could be down towards the flu in terms of mortality, but it could be, 4 or 5%, 6%, et cetera. And then from a spread basis, it was already seen that it was going to be more than the flu, but how much more wasn't sure. We still don't know the answers to all of this. This is my addition to the chart, which I do think we've honed in the answer. And I'll show you a little data around that. Clearly the spreading factor at the higher end of the estimates that were there, that's been one of the real problems with this virus. But clearly with the amount, at that point we didn't realize there was so much asymptomatic and low symptomatic patients. Clearly the overall mortality rate across the population who get infected, significantly lower than what was feared, but probably still very significantly higher than the flu. There's been a couple of different looks at this around the world. In fact, on the left, you can see a table of basically a bunch of studies looking at the infection fatality rate. At the upper right, you see essentially a meta-analysis. Think of it as a study of studies, where they take all the data, they aggregate it, and come to a conclusion. And they came to an infection fatality rate of 0.68%, with a 95% probability running from about 0.5 to 0.8. Put that in perspective, the typical seasonal flu is 0.1 to 0.15. So you're talking probably 4x what we're seeing in the population, but you still have some lower bands of possibility that it could be even lower. A different study from a group that took a different approach and looked at seroprevalence, maybe with some of the tests that may have a little bit of a high false positive rate to get really solid numbers, showed a little bit lower but overlapping results. I think pretty consistently we see this as probably a few times the flu when we look at that. And then in terms of the spreadability, This is our actual experience here as plotted. The UT School of Public Health does this with the spreadability. So remember, there's sort of a baseline characteristic, and then we do things as a society to modify this. So back in those early days, you see an R in the 3 to 4 range, no question, before we really got together and then did first the shutdown and later all the other things you do. You see it coming back not nearly that high in June, and how wildly things got out of control when that was across the population, even with an R that was 1.5 to 2 as opposed to 3 to 4. We're fortunately now really hovering below 1, which is where we need to keep it. So again, those kind of reinforce how this is different than the flu, because the flu has an R of 1.3 as we look at the typical flu each year. So we asked ourselves the question, what does this look like at Houston Methodist, right? We know the flu, we start getting a smattering of cases in September-ish. Most of our cases have happened through April, although you'll sometimes get a tail, and certainly for a couple more months, and even sometimes in the summer months, especially with global travel and everything else. In 17 to 18, we had a pretty bad flu season, the worst we've had in several years, about double what we had in previous years, about double what you see the next couple of years. That was 2,000 patients admitted over the course of mostly that 8-month period, with a 2.5% mortality. If you look at COVID, here we are, going into the end of our 6th month here. So we're not quite 6 months, so we're not even the course that we would see the regular flu. Here we are with 5,400 people admitted. So, more than 2.5 times, pushing triple what we saw on our worst flu season. But look at the mortality, 9%. So you're talking based on the aggregate mortality across 3 years of flu, over 4 times. It's actually pretty consistent with that IFR. This is mortality for people who get admitted to the hospital. So even with flu, you have a 2.2% chance of dying, but you have a 9% chance, on aggregate, of dying if you come to Houston Methodist, unfortunately, with the flu. That's much lower than what we've seen. Dr. Masood showed you some of that data around the world. But look at how many people we have had, unfortunately, succumb to the disease here compared to a flu season. If you look at a little more granular data around that, this is the outcomes by age. And so in the blue up top, you see the age bands, the bars for the flu, for COVID, and in the green you see for the flu. And what you can see is COVID has had a much more even age distribution than the flu, which has tended to, and this was the bad year of the flu that we gave you the data, the 17-18, that has tended to affect kind of upper age people. But what we've seen then is probably not markedly different mortality rates for the few young people that die with both. But as you get into your 30s, particularly in your 40s and 50s and then on, see much, much, much higher mortality with COVID, in fact, severe. Now, Dr. Masood will be the first to tell me we have seen some astonishingly ill 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, postpartum, post-delivery patients, and others. Some of these people are just amazingly ill, but you can see how severe the mortality can be here with COVID. And then finally, just to show you our experience also, this is when you overlay that bad year of flu with our experience with COVID. We sort of truncated the tail end so you could superimpose them. These are not, they therefore are different time periods, but they are superimposed in terms of the course of the virus. What you see is look how quickly COVID shot up, whereas flu sort of gradually increases through that. That's the 1.3 R versus the 3 to 4 R that you saw there in that first wave. That's reason one why this has been so challenging. But what you see also is flu tends to live its course, it moves on, and look when we let our guard down and what we saw obviously happening with COVID the second time. So this is most definitively not the flu. Now, Dr. Sossman talked about the flu. We do have some interesting data from around the world. If you look at the left, you'll actually see in the top set of the world's map, you'll see that there's been much lower flu in the southern hemisphere this year. It's because social distancing, hand hygiene, wearing a mask, they work for the flu and they work for COVID, but they probably work even better for the flu given it spreads a little less aggressively. And what you see on the bottom, on the right, but I'll call your attention to the bottom right, is the US flu curves. And this past year, our flu curve just sort of stopped on a dime when we actually shut down the economy, not surprisingly. So some good news that I think there's reason to believe, hopefully the flu shouldn't be as bad this year. But I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Sossman, with every colleague I have. Why would we chance this year? Get your flu shot. I will tell you, the people we've had who have had both the flu and the COVID-19, I mean, these are people who lost the lottery as opposed to won the lottery. They all die. I mean, or 50, 60% of them die. It's a horrid combination. We need to prevent the flu. If we're going to end up with large plateaus in the hospitals, the last thing we need to do as a society is have flu running rampant, not being able to sort out, does somebody have the flu, does somebody have COVID, filling up beds, et cetera, et cetera. This is all preventable. We can't eliminate it all because the shots are not perfect, but they're really good. And we typically vaccinate 45% of the eligible adult population for the flu, 45%. We need to be vaccinating 100% ideally, but certainly we need to drive that up massively. So you'll see lots of big flu campaigns. Now, how did we bend the curve this time? So here's the curve again. And you'll remember me talking before, it was 18 days from a shutdown order to when we bent the curve. It was a very distinct bend. This time we had less of a distinct bend, but if you do the timing, it's a pretty similar timing. When we had the first phase mask order, which was when we were able to have businesses require masks and really saw a significant increase in mask compliance, at least in places of business, that was June 19th. We started to plateau basically July 3rd, 4th. Do the math, it's a very similar time frame, but it probably wasn't enough. You look at then a true masking order that that really we see very good compliance with now, and you do that from July 3rd, and you go about 2.5, 3 weeks. So they're very similar, and I firmly believe masks are the best substitute for a shutdown, which I am very opposed to. I don't think shutdowns are desirable. They have obviously so many other negative impact. So as I talked about last time, masks are really important. Here's great data using Methodist experience that masks are critically important. Now, it's not just the mask, they're really important, but masks are also a symbol to us that life is not normal. People don't act the same when they're wearing a mask as they do when they're not wearing a mask. And so very, very key thing to continue to push. Lots of good studies out there for regular everyday use for the majority of people. A double ply or more cotton mask shows to be very effective. Good article here if you want to read it in the Wall Street Journal about one of the studies that came out about different kinds of masks. Lots of other data supporting this. This was Mass General Brigham, which they've renamed their combination to recently. And basically what you saw was this was healthcare workers getting sick as they went through the phase. And then they put in masking of healthcare workers and they started to come down. And then they put in masking of patients also, and they really started to come down. Masking, no question, works. Even the very scientific journal Goldman Sachs has taken this on. Actually, it's a great article. And of course, if Goldman's good at one thing, it's numerical analysis, right? These are incredibly smart people. And they took a look at like 4 different methodologies to basically say, do masks work? Came to the definitive conclusion they did a lot of other math basically saying masks protect GDP by a solid 5% was Goldman's conclusion. And so again, masks work. This is one of their graphs that basically showed what happened. You can look at a similar one for mortality. You can see a similar one for case decline, but basically with masking orders, seeing significant improvement. So now let's talk about schools a little bit. Obviously a very, very hot topic, one that everybody's talking about these days. Unfortunately, as I talked about last time, like most things in our society, one that's become very politicized with lots of people staking out positions that are oftentimes not very logical at either end of the spectrum. And like most things in life, the right answer is probably going to be somewhere in between. Personally, and so let me show you a few of the questions that you all have asked. Are we crazy to reopen schools? Shouldn't we open up schools because kids are at low risk and they appear to be more damaged by being out of school than by the virus? How would schools approach the opening? What are the thoughts on that, and will it produce another spike? Do you feel it's safe for high school students versus others and other ages? So let me talk a little bit about those as a group. The first comment I want to make, I want everybody to hear very, very clearly, is that I very firmly believe that our goal needs to be to get our children back to in-person learning. The American Academy of Pediatrics, of whom my wife is a member, these are people who took sacred oaths in their lives and have dedicated their lives to protecting children and making sure of the health, well-being, psychological, physical, etc. of our children. And they have very strongly said that every policy out there needs to be about getting children back to in-person learning as soon as possible when it is safe. They're not saying do that willy-nilly when things are wildly out of control and where you're just going to shut things down in 3 days, but they're saying those need to be our goals. And I subscribe to that. I think that is critically important. So you asked a lot of other questions as well. What kinds of conditions could people go back? What's a reasonable daily case count to go back? So let me give you a little bit data around that, and then I'll talk a little more generally about schools. Many countries have actually done this because of different cycles of education, and some actually got some schooling back in the late spring. Most of these are April, May, even June timeframe. The cases per million people that these countries or areas that you see here were experiencing sometimes were as low as 0 to 5. And the highest I think on there is Denmark, is about 35 or so per million people. Right now, if we're at about 1,700 people in Houston per day on average last week being diagnosed, we're at about 240 something, 250 daily cases per million people. Now we've come down 28%. And if there's a little lag time in the data, maybe we've come down a little more. You saw more from Houston Methodist. We have to get that number down. There's no data to suggest that it's safe. In fact, I believe we would see significant risk of dramatic outbreaks in our community when we put hundreds of thousands of interactions back, people back into interaction in the society. And so we've been working at the Texas Medical Center to try and inform this. We've not gone so far as to say, here's a policy statement, here's the definitive recommendation, because ultimately it is not our decision. This is school districts' decisions, political leaders' decisions. But what we're saying to the community is, look, if we want to get this in control, we can focus together on the key metrics. What are those key metrics? When it is less than 1, it's how many people anybody spreads to another, will result in a decline in the virus. So we have to have sustained R below 1. We actually are doing okay lately on that. We need to get the case count down dramatically. We had a good day on Monday, so the bar looks a little better than it looked as yesterday, because this gets shown every day and there's a day lag in this. But the bottom line is we're still a long ways away from something like 200, which would be around 30 per million. We may be able to get away with a little bit higher number. We're not saying these are an absolute, but the combination, much like flying a plane when you're looking at all of your different metrics and different dials, needs to be in a much better place. And then positivity below 5%. And we've made very good progress. So I think we're on the way, but we have to do things together as a society. I would make the personal editorial comment that says the most important thing, when I talked about our politicians' sacred and, is to get our children back to school. That's our societal goal. So everything else should wait. So we should not advance other things. We should not be opening up football games. We should not be bringing 50,000 people to a football stadium. We should not advance other parts of the economy, in my opinion, because our children should come first, and the priority should be getting them back to their in-person education. We know that younger children particularly struggle with this. We know how hard it is on their families. We know how hard it is on our healthcare workers who are having to juggle all of those things. Older children, probably do better with digital learning, but we have vast differences, obviously, in socioeconomic status, access to computers, access to internet, et cetera, et cetera. We need to get our children back. But to do that, as I talked about last time, we're going to need to continue to make some sacrifices on our social side, on our sporting side, and other things. We at Houston Methodist, many of the TMC institutions, have spent a lot of time, and there's a lot of great work from the CDC around the country, from all the educational institutions, on safe ways to handle children in schools. Clearly, it will not be like it was before. In my mind, every child who can, and that's the vast majority, should wear a mask, even though some of the masking orders may not include younger children. The fact of the matter is, if you tell a 6-year-old, hey, wear a mask, and you make it a little bit fun and you make some games out of it, they'll probably wear their mask a lot more readily than the 15-year-old will. We should be doing that across across the age groups. We know that. Then schools need to figure out how they're cohorting children so that you don't have all the mass kind of connections that are happening. They need to figure out how to spread out. They need to figure out how to put protections in classrooms, obviously lots of hand gel, other things like that. Where they can put schooling outdoors, we're really lucky in Houston, once we get past another month or two here, that this is a great climate to go, set up under a covered outdoor gym area, some different classroom settings or whatever that may be, or tents or other things like that. So lots of creative things the school districts can do to do that. We get asked a lot of questions about what happens then if there's an outbreak. So cohorting makes a lot of sense, right? If you can keep your children mostly cohorted, and of course that's how lower school works, upper school tends to not. So it's very challenging for schools to figure some of this out. But if you can put a cohort of kids together and then there's a problem, you can shut down a cohort rather than shut down a school. But if any of us believe we can try to open up schools, which I firmly believe we need to, without some missteps, without a cohort that gets closed or an elementary school here or a high school there, obviously we're being naive. We know that's going to happen. And it comes back to that unity message. If that just becomes political fodder for each end of the spectrum to throw things at each other or bomb each other, it'll be a mess. Obviously, if we can all agree with the advice of the pediatricians, which makes so much sense, we can move things forward, I think, very well. Lots of questions about sports, and I wish I had the answers. I don't know all the answers to this. I don't think anybody knows all the answers to this. Obviously, we all believe that there's many facets to education. Of course, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but there's the social aspects which have been significantly negative, obviously, today. But then there's arts and sports and music and everything else that's part of that. I'm a conservative thinker when it comes to education. From my standpoint, the main thing my kids need to get is the reading, writing, and arithmetic and the socialization parts. So, personally, I would say use caution around sports. Take that a little more slowly than getting kids back to school. But obviously, we know outdoor settings are very safe. If you're not talking about a mass group of children together working outdoors in a sport, I think you have a lot more flexibility. So, where you look for conditioning training, where they do things that are distance and safe and spread out, I think we can go past that. Honestly, there are many other people more expert that can answer some of those other detailed questions. I'm going to wrap things up, and we're going to bring it to a video in a second, and then come back with a good amount of time left today for some questions. First thing, I want to again thank all of our people, Dr. Masood and Dr. Sossman, both did that. I want to thank both of them as well. Many of you always ask how you can help, and you all have been so wonderful throughout this. I'm going to show you a little image of how you don't need to help. We've got, I think this funny cartoon, but we've got Labor Day coming up again. And I will tell you, I was in a near panic before the 4th of July, having seen Memorial Day. We spent time putting up billboards, wrapping the Chronicle, other things to change behavior. And we still saw a second spike after the 4th of July. We have to recognize that it's time for personal sacrifice. We've got to sacrifice some of the social side of things so that we can make sure as a society we can do the things that matter, the actual economy, the kids getting back to school, obviously the health and safety of humanity. Colleges are really interesting. I've got a son we're sending back to college soon. He goes to Duke. UNC got a week into it and have already shut down. Why did they shut down? Because they've had a big outbreak. Why did they have a big outbreak? Because of parties. So the kids went and they had, as kids do, massive parties. And guess what? In the era of COVID, if you have massive parties, lots of people get sick. We've got to figure out collectively together with our young people, our older people, everybody else, how we defer gratification and how we focus on what really matters. Because take UNC as just a small example. Now they're fully virtual instead of getting to do something they would have much preferred in a week because these things happen. Again, we have to do the right things as a society together. Unity, what I talked about last time. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to us today. I'm going to transition things today now to a video. Dr. Masood talked about how important it is to care for people both with COVID and without. So this is about a gentleman, Harvey Catchings, who's a former pro athlete who was cared for here at Houston Methodist. Thank you.
Last year, I spent over 2 months in an ICU. It might seem like anyone's worst nightmare, but for me, the critical care medicine team at Houston Methodist made the experience an incredible one. It started in early 2019. I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, and doctors told me I wouldn't live long without a heart transplant. In that moment, I realized that for me to live would mean someone else would have to die. And that was really tough. I'm grateful to the family whose loved one gave me the gift of life, but sorry for their loss. As a retired athlete who spent 11 seasons in the NBA, I found it hard to come to terms with my body failing me. Being a Christian, I just turned it over to God and trusted Him to handle the whole situation. And I've been blessed with a very strong family. My wife, kids, other family members, and friends were committed to walking with me through this whole process. As I was placed on the transplant waiting list, the question was, where do we go from here? I was admitted into Houston Methodist on June 17, 2019 for observation until a heart became available. I stayed on the 10th floor of the Walter Tower in the Marc J. Housknecht MD cardiac ICU unit. It worked out well because the room had a great view, and I got to know the nurses by name. From the doctors to the nurses to the housekeepers, the team on that floor became my friends. We go walking every day to maintain my strength, and I got to tell you, it was a sight to see because a 6'10" man walking around with the nurse that barely came to my chest was a sight to behold. We passed by different rooms and people would laugh. I like to kid around and joke and keep things light, so it made me smile to take other people's worries away for a little while. The nurses amazed me with how much they gave of themselves to make sure that I was comfortable. They even took the time to stop by my room at the end of their shifts to tell me goodbye each day. I received my heart transplant on August 28, 2019. I'm forever grateful to all the doctors and the team who helped make that 7-hour surgery a successful one. When it came time to leave the hospital after my recovery, I teared up a little bit. The honeymoon was over and it was time for me to start living my life again. Before I left, I tried to make sure every one of those ICU nurses knew just how much they poured into my life. I walked through the doors of the Houston Methodist again last month, and it was a little different. I stayed in the hospital for 7 days for routine medical follow-up care. I was in a completely different tower, and the team was great, but I didn't get to head over to the Walters Tower because that unit is dedicated to helping COVID-19 patients. I didn't get to see the friends I made over a year ago. When the nurses were working with me last year, there was no pandemic. They knew that they could go home to their families and recharge, but now they have to exercise more caution when they go home. They go through so much now. This pandemic threatening the very people's lives who took care of me, who saved my life, hits me in the chest. I always told them, you won't ever see me grouchy. You'll see me thankful. And now I want to say I'm even more thankful to them today than I was a year ago.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks again for all of your support. So we've got a nice amount of time today for some questions and answers. We took a bunch in advance, and we've taken a number have been coming in today. We're going to do our very best to get to as many as we possibly can. I'm going to mainly focus first on the ones that came in ahead of time, just out of respect for those who sent them in. But I want to start with one that came in just now because it's so topical to everything we talked about. I'll turn it to Dr. Sossman. But it was a question about the timing of the flu shot, because they are starting to be available, obviously, in Walgreens and CVS and places like that. And people are asking, is it too soon? Should I take it now? When is the optimal time to get my flu shot? Dr. Sossman.
You could take it now. I would probably wait until September. I would not wait much past October because the flu season, you can get the flu September 15th. So I'd say early September would be the time when I'm going to be looking to get my flu shot.
Yeah. And that's when we'll be vaccinating. The bulk of our employees will go through September into October that we will be vaccinating everyone for Houston Methodist. So honestly, there's some data that says a little bit later is probably better in an average flu season, but it's much better not to miss it and not to forget to do it, wait too long. I don't know yet what we're going to see in terms of flu shot supply given the push. Here, hopefully, and the manufacturers tell us they've made a bunch, but I wouldn't be that surprised to see some shortages in the tail end. So I'd probably, as Dr. Sussman said, start in that September timeframe. So, I got asked this question. I think I've already covered this. Do I believe the city should be shut down? I believe that's an incredibly blunt instrument that should hopefully never be used again. Now, I'll be honest, when we were watching that curve go up in late June and right at the beginning of July, I was starting to wonder and getting pretty close to saying we needed to get there. But part of that was we weren't masking. We waited a very long time to get to the point where we were masking. I'm hopeful this never has to happen again, but it most certainly does not need to happen right now. We need to keep doing the things we're doing, do them collectively, and get this curve back down. So we get lots of questions. This has come up before, but the science evolves. Has the COVID-19 virus mutated? Dr. Sussman.
Sure, it has. I mean, let me just say, all viruses mutate. They don't have the spell checking apparatus that our cells do when we copy our own DNA and cells divide. So they all mutate. Yeah, the coronavirus has basically 6 big kind of strains of it that have circulated worldwide. The one that started out in Wuhan, China has pretty much died out. Really the prevalent one now is the G strain, which is that one that you've all heard about. It's the one that supposedly makes it more infectious. And it probably does, because that spiky protein, it makes that spiky protein more stable and it creates more copies of it. So it probably does make it a little bit more infectious. There's absolutely no evidence that it makes the disease more severe. If anything, people are asking whether maybe it makes it less severe. So, this is just what viruses do. The COVID-19 virus is not particularly a fast mutator compared with HIV or influenza. So this is something to keep an eye on, but nothing to be concerned about now.
Great. Well, thanks, Dr. Sussman. Last time we had Dr. Drews here, we talked, and others, over a couple talks, we've talked a lot about some of the therapies that are out there. Dr. Massoud, we got a bunch of therapies, or questions rather, about kind of home remedies, home things that people might take. So fish oil, omega-3, should we take baby aspirin to reduce some of the vascular complications or the clotting complications? Are there other supplements to take? Again, another aspirin question about people over 50 and taking aspirin. Give us your thoughts around, sort of how you care for yourself at home, any things you should be doing if you do contract the disease.
So I think one of the things which you've learned is that remaining active is one of the very important things to help prevent, even if you get COVID-19. And as far as aspirin is concerned, no medication is without any side effects. If you're already taking aspirin, go ahead and keep on taking. But if you've never taken aspirin, most of the societies don't necessarily take that you should start taking aspirin because there is a risk for bleeding inside your stomach and other parts of area. Now, there is no valid study to state that, but however, they've started to do some trials on aspirin. And as far as omega-3, I think this is just like any other element, people take it, but there's no robust science and evidence. Coming about to the supplements, as Dr. Sussman also mentioned, if your vitamin D level is low, it's very appropriate to take vitamin D level because it has shown to give a more indication of protecting to have less harm, especially with lung. The other supplements are zinc, which increase your fighting power of your white blood cells. The other element, which is vitamin C, and acetylcysteine. These are the two elements, these over-the-counter thing, which help the body as antioxidants and prevent. So if you're not sure that your diet is as full, robust with fruits and vegetables, that's okay to take it. But be mindful that overtaking or extra taking or doubling, tripling of the recommended daily allowance is not beneficial. In fact, that can damage your liver and kidney. So be mindful of the recommended daily allowance and take it.
So mostly get your exercise, rest, have a good balanced diet, maybe a supplement in general, a multivitamin or some supplements of a couple things if you don't have that good balanced diet. I think maybe find out your vitamin D level.
Yeah, find out your vitamin D level, because that is quite a bit low in a lot of patients, and that has been shown to affect, especially in flu season. But sleeping and exercising supersedes anything.
Thank you, Dr. Masood. Okay, moving things along. Okay, so a couple questions about testing here. I know many of you have had this experience, and we're getting asked that question, are we chasing our tails? Because every time we come in contact, we get tested. Should we get tested? How do we figure that out? I mean, I certainly, as a clinician, have had many patients I've tested, some of them several times because of different interactions that they've had.
Yeah, well, that's a toughie, and it really depends. What type of exposure did you have? Was it were you having dinner with somebody for 2.5 hours and talking a lot at each other? Were you wearing masks? Or were you just sort of talking to your neighbor from 6 feet away across, over the fence? Also, really important, what's going to happen next? You think you were exposed to somebody with COVID? Were you planning to visit mom in the long-term care facility next week? So what's the consequence of having COVID and not realizing it? I'll tell you one thing you should definitely not do, which is what some relatives of mine did. They all wanted to go to the beach. They were going to share 2 big houses, and they were very worried about, well, what if one of us has COVID? So they all arranged to get tested. This was not in Texas. This was out east. So they all got tested. They went to the beach. Out there, you can't get the test results for like 10 days. They'd been at the beach for a week, and one of them, oh yeah, your test was positive. So of course they all freaked out. The whole vacation was a disaster. So if you do get tested, wait for the results before you do anything. It's just amazing how many people don't think about this.
So well, speaking of that, then one of the questions we got across the line today was, can we get a 24-hour PCR? What can Methodist do if somebody would like a quick result? Talk about our turnaround times, how somebody can get test results.
Yeah, basically at Houston Methodist, we've got enough capacity that we turn the tests around in 24 hours routinely. That's not a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, if somebody orders them, I mean, oftentimes if I get somebody in the morning, I'm able to give them a call in the evening with their results. So we can turn them around very quickly. There are ways to do that. We can send out some information about how you would get tested through your physician. At Houston Methodist, we're certainly there and happy to help with everybody. Okay, so another testing question for you, Dirk. Antibody tests, are they accurate, and why should we do them? I guess I'd add to that.
Well, I think that's the more better question. There's a whole variety of antibody tests. Some of them, like there's one called enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, or ELISA, which is very, very accurate. There are others that are more like point-of-care testing, kind of like pregnancy tests, that are, well, they vary. Let's just say that. I'm not entirely sure in this state of our knowledge whether there's really a point in doing antibody testing except for purposes of epidemiology. Because you don't really know now. I have a hunch that if you have antibodies, you're protected, but I don't really know that. So if I tested and I had COVID antibodies, I really wouldn't behave any differently than I do now, not knowing that fact. So I'm not sure it makes much of a difference now.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Dr. Masood, let's talk about obesity. We had a question about how obesity impacts COVID. We actually saw some of the data I showed that we've seen a little lower number or percentage of patients with obesity now, but what have you seen and observed?
So obesity plays a role in many ways. There are certain proteins which are more in obese patients, and these proteins lead to much more blood being more thick. That means they're much more higher to have blood clots. There are certain cells, especially the fat cells in obese patients, and a lot more if they have insulin. Those cells have more receptors which allow more doors for the virus to come in. So the virus that comes in, they're much more likely to infect the cells versus other patients. Not only that, they've got some other elements of hormone which is less adaptogenic, and that leads to that the lower level of those hormones leads to a body's much more aggressive response of inflammation, and they have much more lung injury. So if you can simplify that, people who are much more obesity or much more diabetic, especially if they're obese and diabetic, their blood is much more likely to be thicker, much more likely to be clot, much more hyper response from the body, and the virus can go in the cells. So that's why, if you saw from Dr. Boom's, much more, even though lower this time, but a very high incidence of obese patient getting admitted. So obesity plays a big role. That's why a healthy diet and exercise is so important every single day.
And so when you talk about obesity, Dr. Masood, talk about like a body mass index. Are you talking about people who are, a couple points over where they should be, a little belly, or are you talking about, real obesity?
I'm talking really about real obesity. You're talking about body mass index, which in the normal range is about 24, which is normal. But when you go into the patient that we're seeing, 30, 40, 60 body mass index.
But even 30 would
Even 30 would be very dangerous. So if you're obese, then that is puts you higher.
So if you want to know, some of your risk, you can just Google it in 2 seconds. You can do a body mass index calculator. It's your height and your weight, basically. And if you are over that number, you are in a higher risk group. I mean, I will say, I know from talking with you, many other people, when we see the young 30-year-old who's just doing terribly, way more often than not, unless it's a underlying immune issue, they're very obese in those cases.
You're absolutely right. Especially in the younger population, one of the common denominator is obesity, and even more moderate obesity. So I think, as Dr. Boom mentioned, you may want to check it easily, and let's do something about it.
Great, thank you. Okay. Well, Dr. Sossman, a couple questions about children. So I know there's been some research conflicting at times, like so many things in COVID, about children passing the virus to adults, and talk about that, and talk about, kind of the clinical course that has been seen in children just in general.
Sure. In terms of kids passing the virus on to adults, I think the data is pretty clear that kids have the same amount of virus as adults do in their system. But younger children, less than 10 years old, are less likely to pass it on. Nobody really knows why that is. I mean, it's, the volume of air they exhale is lower, and, this sounds silly, but, they're lower to the ground. So they're not breathing in the same airstream that the adults are inhaling. But that's pretty clear. But after about age 10 or so, the risk appears to be very similar to any adult. As everybody knows, in general, the course of the disease is much milder for children. Your chance of being hospitalized as a child is about 5% of the chance that an adult has. So an adult is about 20 times more likely to be hospitalized than a child. Just as with adults, Black and Latino children have a higher risk of more severe disease. Obese children are at higher risk. And clearly there are some cases, unusual, but sadly not unusual enough, where children do have very severe illnesses, such as this multi-system inflammatory illness that some kids have.
Dr. Masood, can you talk about visitation in the ICU? It's been you mentioned this, how tough that's been. Obviously, we have significant curtailed visitation policies. What is it now, and where do you see that changing over time?
So as you know, Dr. Boom, that in ICU, you have the most vulnerable patients, the most sickest, who are automatically high risk for any infection because of all the devices they need. So these patients who are more vulnerable, we want to minimize them getting more sicker. So I think you have to look at the whole society's rate of number of cases. You have to look at the infectivity rate. And just like people have parameters to that, the overall rate of infectivity or infection rate and positivity rate in case go down, I think we'll be in a better position for allowing patients to come in. Now, we do have some exceptions and we allow in certain circumstances some family member, but I think the world is evolving. I think the technology is made easier. We do foresee, but at this stage, don't think so we're really ready yet. I think immunization and vaccine will play a big role, how liberal we get in a lot of these things wise. But you can always get your connection to your family member. I would wait for the positivity rate, the vaccine role, and overall number of cases to come down before we feel that your loved one who we are committed to is not more at high risk.
Thank you, Faisal. And so I want to ask we have a few more questions. They're mostly pretty short answers, rapid fire, 10-second answers here. Talk about MMR. There's been some discussion. I know this is a hard one to do rapid fire, but there's been a discussion that MMR, which is another vaccination, might actually give immunity or some protection here. What do we know about that?
No proof.
No proof, basically. Some thought that it revs up the immune system or something, but no real good proof.
Okay.
You're going to violate my 10-second rule now.
That's right.
I tried.
There's a bunch of these, like oral polio vaccine, some people have talked about, the BCG, anti-tuberculosis vaccine. The idea is that they rev up your immune system kind of non-specifically. The MMR, there's actually a thought that the rubella component might share some genomic sequence homology with COVID, but again, no proof.
Great. Okay. And would you volunteer in a trial?
Already have.
Yeah. Should other people volunteer in the trial?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think we'd all say the exact same thing on that. Okay. Wiping down containers, packages, that kind of thing. Is that just too over the top now? Do you do that when you bring things home?
No, I
just wash your hands.
Wash your hands. Wash your hands.
It's the same thing I do. I mean, we bring in things from outside. I'll wash my hands, but I don't wipe things down. I think that's overkill, quite honestly. Walking my dog, I pass runners all the time. I'm not wearing a mask. They're not wearing a mask. I'll handle this one. I tell you, I walk my dogs all the time. You just give people a wide berth. I do not think outside in the vast majority of situations. Now, if you've got an autoimmune illness or something, it may be a different story. But for the vast majority of us, just give people a little bit of a wide berth, and you should be able to very, very safely, move past other people in the community. Healthcare outlook for the rest of the year, we've got to get people getting both arms of care, COVID and non-COVID. We've talked previously about different scenarios of potential pandemics. If you remember a couple months ago, I said, well, there's 3, and I thought the fall peak was maybe the most likely, but another peak in the summer was second most likely, and the bubbling along was probably not very likely. I think we know that third one likely, it ain't going to happen. Now the question is, do we have another peak in the fall? If I had to predict, I don't know how high it will be, but we're going to come back up at some point here in the fall because of many things we've talked about here today. So my team here is very much preparing to be at least as high as we were this summer, if not, significantly higher at some point. I hope and pray that that's readiness, that was good preparedness, but not necessary. I hope and pray that masks and some other things can help attenuate that. Obviously, we want to get to that, beginning of the finish line, the rheostat, maybe at the end of the year, early next year. And that's not that far away at the end of the day here. So we're hoping we can all kind of keep doing the things to get to that point. Before I get to this last question, Dr. Sussman, Russia and their vaccine. We got one coming over that, and they've said they're ready to go. They're vaccinating everybody.
Yeah, the question was, do they really have a vaccine or is it propaganda? And the answer is both. They do have a vaccine. It's been through phase 1 and phase 2 with apparently a fairly small number of military volunteers. They've declared it safe and effective based on data that the FDA wouldn't wrap a wet fish in. But
how do you really feel about that, Derek?
But listen, despite all that, it is possible that it is safe and
Yeah,
effective.
it could be.
No, nobody's proven it isn't. So they do have a vaccine. Vlad is obviously making big propaganda about it. So
Well, to your point earlier, when you're going to vaccinate billions of people, even at a low rate, you can have some pretty bad things happen. And so we firmly believe it's necessary to do the requisite clinical trials to get to that point. I'd volunteer for the trials without a second thought, as we all have said. Obviously, there's some very small risk to that, but I think it's very small. But I would not take a vaccine that had not been tested and go give it to billions of people. Those are very different things, obviously for society. So I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of a teaser. We got asked about what's been seen or reported about long-term health effects, particularly mental health, depression, anxiety, post-COVID. So going forward, we're going to do these town halls about monthly, and we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to continue to have a focus on COVID, of course, because I think that's going to be a hot topic. But we want to bring in many of our centers of excellence going forward and really feature some of the other things going on here and how they interface many times with COVID. This is a very critically important hot topic. And so next month, we're going to have Lisa Ortegon, who is our chief nursing executive, talking about that kind of nursing perspective. And we're going to have Dr. Ben Weinstein, who is our chair of pathology, talking about mental health. And we'll be doing updates as we've done today about COVID. Obviously, if there's any hot vaccine and treatment things, we'll always make sure to sneak those in, and I'll give you an update on the situation in the community. So thanks for tuning in. We get about 700+ people for each of these, which is amazing and humbling. We appreciate, as always, all of your support. Stay safe, stay healthy, keep wearing your mask. Don't go do too much on Labor Day weekend, and we can bring this thing down together. Thank you so much. God bless.